Hello, I'm John Hooton. I'm a past chairman of the Norwich Society and I'm also a Norwich City Guide. And it was whilst researching information for one of their tours, A Pub for Every Day, that I became interested in finding out the location of some of our past inns and public houses. We have lost so many in the last century. This becomes fairly obvious when you look at the list in the survey completed by the Norwich Society in 1986. Many of those have gone. Quite a few of those buildings have been demolished, but many of them have actually been converted to other uses, and they often leave behind interesting clues that portray their former use as an inn. And it is this information that I became interested in, and it will form the basis of this talk. And because it's a PowerPoint instead of a guided walk, I can flit about all over Norwich and the suburbs in a way that would be completely impossible to cover the distances were it a walk. So I hope you find this talk as informative and interesting as I have found it in compiling it. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is John Hooton, and my talk for the Norwich Society Historians virtual talk series is called The Norwich Pub Detective. This looks and examines what evidence and clues can be looked for in Norwich buildings which indicate that they have once been a pub. However, first, we ought to clarify what is a drinking establishment. I will be concerned only with licensed premises. However, we need to remember that during the 19th century, there were a lot of beer houses. So what exactly was a beer house? At the beginning of the 19th century, there was a lot of concern about drunkenness, and the biggest culprit was thought to be gin. So it was thought that if people could be persuaded to drink beer instead, that would reduce drunkenness. This led to the Beer House Act of 1830. This act abolished beer tax, extended pub opening hours from 15 to 18 hours a day, but you needed a license from the local justices. However, it introduced premises which could sell only beer, no spirits, from 4 a.m. till 10 p.m. And they did not need a license, but just had to pay 2 guineas, which would have been about £185 today. And they could brew and sell beer on the premises. It was a great success. Soon there were 24,000 of them, and the shopkeepers sold beer alongside their shop wares. It could well be that Norwich is returning to that, because in Exchange Street we have recently had the Butcher Boy, which, as well as selling meat, will serve you with a pint of Guinness. As it says, come in for the crack and the crackling. And also down on St Benedict's, we have the Arboretum, which describes itself as a combined bar and antique shop, with historic cocktails on sale and taxidermy thrown in to the bargain. So, we all know that Norwich was known for having a pub for every day. However, this is fairly inaccurate. When you look at the figures, it's much more like 2 pubs for every day. In 1878, we had 593 pubs and 38 beer houses within the city walls. That led to 631. And in a survey of 1890, Norwich was placed second in the number of fully licensed premises per head of population in the UK, just after Liverpool. So it's a pretty fair guess that every other building you look at that's pre-1900 must have been a pub at some point. So what led to the loss of pubs? Well, this was partly due to the temperance movement gaining strength. This is the drink map of Norwich, created by the Gospel Temperance Union in 1892. They also come to the conclusion that there were 631 licensed premises, marked by red spots for pubs and red stars for beer houses. I think I ought to point out at this juncture that north is on the left-hand side of the map, so we are looking east. Here we have Chapelfield Gardens moving to the marketplace and the castle, further on towards the cathedral. And you can see that there are several places within the city which didn't lack a shortage of pubs. If we look, for example, along King Street, where there's now one licensed premises, there were a lot. Burr Street is another hotspot worthy of a pub crawl, as is Oak Street and Magdalen Street. So what led to all these pubs disappearing? Well, in 1869, since 1869, magistrates have been empowered to close pubs in areas where they were considered superfluous. However, they rarely exercised this power until the growth of the temperance movement. In 1904, the Licensing Act was passed, and this made it a statutory requirement to close pubs in areas where they were deemed superfluous. Also, owners of closed licensed houses could claim for a compensation fund that was set up. This was financed by a compulsory levy on pubs relative to the value of the property. Many pubs were then shut down by the licensing authorities in the period leading up to the First World War. The First World War led to more pressures on pubs because opening hours were reduced, and quite a few, of course, in the Second World War were damaged. And then throughout the 20th century, we've had a combination of other leisure activities and changing of habits, particularly to drinking at home with cheap drinks from supermarkets, which led to a big reduction in pub numbers. So this talk will look at what clues we can see in buildings still in Norwich that indicated they were a pub. Some of them are fairly obvious. This definitely looks as if it was a pub. This is on the junction of Stafford Street and Hayham Street, and indeed it was a pub. It was the Stafford Arms, closed by Watney Man in 1976, but the exterior has not been greatly altered. However, some are more tricky to work out. These buildings here on Earlham Road look very much as though they're purpose-built, semi-detached houses, but it was the Volunteer public house, as we can see in these photos. And by cleverly altering the roofing over the double entrance doors, they've been turned into two semi-detached private residences. This also was a pub, believe it or not. It was built to replace this one, the Boar's Head in St Stephen's, which was severely damaged in the war. When this was pulled down as the road was widened after the war, this is the building that replaced it. Doesn't look like a pub, and indeed it wasn't terribly successful, as it only survived from 1952 to about 1967. So we will look at the more obvious clues that can be found to identify pubs. What sort of evidence? Well, street names and yard names still persist and are a very good guide to where pubs used to be. Sometimes the buildings actually have helpful plaques on them. In a few cases, the pub, although no longer a pub, still retains its name. And in others, signs are retained. You can frequently find symbols on the building that had some connection with the name of the pub. Pub signs that have survived are also a good indicator. Stained glass in buildings is another indicator, and some more subtle signs such as supports for pub signs and cellars for the delivery of beer. So we'll start looking at street names. Now, Rampant Horse Street is a fine example. A very ancient pub there, probably took its name from the fact that that was the original site of Norwich's horse market, and it existed from the 13th to the 16th centuries, and it was called in its early days the Ramping Horse Inn. However, it was a place that got a poor reputation and was closed in the 1890s when it was replaced by Curl's department store. That had a stone tablet in it of a rampant horse fixed into the wall of the store. But that got lost when it was bombed during the Second World War. Its replacement, now Debenhams, however, still has a reminder of this pub, as well as the name of the street, where if you look at the entranceway in Rampant Horse Street, you will find this rampant horse in the front of the doorway, marking the connection. Now, another pub name of a street just round the corner, of course, is the Red Lion. Here we have Red Lion Street. That was a famous Norwich pub, and in the 16th century was famous for plays. In fact, Queen Elizabeth players were performing at the Red Lion Inn with people that included Dick Tarleton, who was Queen Elizabeth's favourite clown and supposedly taught Will Kemp everything he knew. During the play that had commenced there, someone came in with trying to get in without paying. This created a struggle, and the takings were dropped and stolen. So Tarleton, Bentley and Singer leapt off the stage in full uniform and ran off to chase the culprit. A bystander threw a stone at Bentley's head, and Singer struck the man with his sword, who later died from his wounds. It's the investigation into this, which is why we know about what happened in the old Red Lion. Now, the Red Lion disappeared quite a while ago and was replaced by the Cricketers' Arms that you can see here in this shot. This does not look like Red Lion Street today, because come 1900, this was cleared and the road was widened for trams, and it was replaced by anchor buildings. But they still also have clues. If we look at the top, we'll see a fine designation of the anchor, but these buildings were built by Bullard's Brewery, and this was their emblem for the Anchor Brewery. One of the reasons they did this was because they lost both the Cricketers Inn and also the Orford Arms. But there are still some indications that they used to be in this pub. When the sun is in the right direction, you can see a ghostly remains of the Cricketers' Arms. Here in this close-up, we've got the start of the word cricket and their arms again. And this also is true for the Orford Arms, which was at the end of the new buildings. Here we can see the Orford Arms, and at the top there is the emblem again of Bullard's Brewery. The Orford Arms, of course, was more famous for the fact of its cellar, which had a lot of very famous musicians coming and playing there in the 60s and 70s, such as Eric Clapton, Rod Stewart, Ginger Baker, David Bowie and Jimi Hendrix. Now also throughout Norwich we find many of the pub yards the names of are still here. This is a fine example in St Benedict Street, where the Queen of Hungary, which was this building here, still has the Queen of Hungary yard. There's also a helpful plaque in the pavement there telling us that the Queen of Hungary was this building. These were put in by Hart. Across the road from that, you will find a little lane known as Three Kings Lane, and indeed that took its name from the building on the corner here, which is the Three Kings pub. A little further down St Benedict Street, you will find the Adam and Eve yard, again over the yard that goes into what was at one time the Adam and Eve pub. However, next door to that, we find a fairly similar building with a similar yard, but no name. But this too, indeed, was another pub. This was the Cardinal's Cap, seen here in about 1960, when it was put up for sale. We'll move on towards looking at helpful plaques. This thatched building in Westlegate was, I was told when I arrived in Norwich, a pub called the Barking Dickey. Considering that the Barking Dickey closed down midway through the 19th century, it is very strange that the Norwich collective memory managed to remember what it was called. However, it's probably been helped by this plaque here. And we can see here, this tells us that the Barking Dickey Inn, this is Norfolk's dialect for the singing donkey, and derives from a badly painted sign of the Light Horseman. The Light Horseman was on a horse, which was so badly painted, everybody referred to it as a donkey, and therefore the pub became known as the Barking Dickey. It hasn't been a pub though for a good 150 years. Norwich has 6 thatched buildings within the city walls, and 4 of them are linked to drinking establishments. This one in Rosemary Lane was the Rosemary Tavern, and we can see here the telltale sign of the old cellar doors still remaining. There's also a useful plaque here which reminds us that this house, at one time the Pilgrims Hall, became the Rosemary Tavern. Perhaps this is better known in Elm Hill, the Britain's Arms, now the name of a coffee shop and tea shop, whereas of course at one time it was a pub called the Britain's Arms. And the 4th one is this building in St Swithin's Alley, and this is called the Hampshire Hog. If you go round behind it, you will find a back garden, and over the back garden we find the title that it was the Hampshire Hog Yard. It certainly was. This, however, was not the Hampshire Hog pub. Its garden, the yard, belongs to the Hampshire Hog, which used to stand at the other end of the garden and has now been demolished. If we go to St Benedict Street, and this is a little warning about plaques, we will find at Cook's Instruments store a very fine Victorian frontage, which looks very much as though it could have been a pub. And if we examine the columns beside the door, we might even get a clue that this was indeed the Prince of Wales from the feathers that we see there. It was the Prince of Wales, and there is a plaque in the pavement to tell us of that fact. However, the plaque is being placed in the wrong place and stands in front of this building, which was never a pub, whereas next door was the Prince of Wales. So caution needs to be exercised. Sometimes the building has retained the pub name. This is off the Aylsham Road, the corner of Junction Road and Shorncliffe Road, and this building here looks completely different in character from the row of terraced houses that we see disappearing into the distance. And if you approach it and look at the front, you find out that it was the Laken Arms. And if you look up at the gables, we see that we can find out that it belonged to Lakens and Company and the year in which it was built. Now, near to the Dereham Road in Golding Street, you will find this building. Again, not looking like a pub, but walk on a little further, go round the corner, and we find not only a pub sign, but the name of the pub. And it was indeed the Britannia. It was only closed in 2006. And here we see it in happier days when it was actually a pub. North of the city in Bull Close, Bull Close does of course still have a very fine pub that is open, the Plasterers Arms on the corner. But if you walk up a little further, you come across this building, built in 1939, and the sign that it was the Bricklayers Arms, which was closed in 1994. The sign stayed, and also some of the leaded and stained glass in the doors and windows, which is mentioned by the Norwich Society's 1986 pub survey. Here we can see some of the stained glass. This building was near to, we used to be called the Brewers Arms back in the 19th century, and it was near to the Bull Close Brewery, which has since been demolished. So it seems strange that this road is called Bull Close, since there isn't a Bull Close, there isn't a Bull pub anywhere around, or it's there. If we look to the building next door to the Bricklayers Arms, it again has certain characteristics. A corner entrance doorway, which could possibly be of a pub, an area where there could have been another pub signpost. And if we look over here, we will see doors that could possibly have led to a cellar. And this arrangement is still the case in St Benedict's. For example, the 10 Bells still has a similar arrangement for its cellar, and a little way up the street, the Plough in St Benedict's likewise has that. And indeed, this was the Bull, which Bull Close is named after, and which served as the brewery tap of the Bull Close Brewery back in the 19th century. Still in northern part of the city, at the end of Spencer Road, we find this building, which proclaims it is the Bramford Stores. One time it spent a while as the Bramford Arms as well. Now there's a warning here about we can't always trust names. This building in King Street has a fine beam saying it is the Prince's Inn. But if we look at the yard, the name of the yard is Shipyard, and indeed this was the ship and not the Prince's Inn. Although some people think that this beam itself possibly came from the Prince's Inn that used to stand in Princes Street near Tombland. If we go to the corner of Churchill Road and Silver Road, we find a modern building, and it has this plaque embedded into it in beautiful Art Nouveau writing. We see the Signet, and it's called that because it was indeed the Signet pub. Now the Signet got its license after the closure and demolition of the Two Neck Swan in the marketplace, and it stayed as a pub until 2004 when it was demolished and replaced by the modern building on the left. It's a pity, it's nice that they decided to keep the name, but it's a pity that they didn't also keep some of the wonderful brickwork and tile work that was found on the original building as well. Sometimes the actual pub sign stays even though it's no longer a pub. Here we see the Cat and Fiddle in Magdalen Street. Now, the Norwich Society survey, which was carried out in 1986, noted that the old corner door has been filled in and replaced by a new central door. And here we can see a picture in the past where the corner doorway has gone, and that's the new central door. However, when it was restored after being converted to private dwelling, the old doorway was reinstated. And we can see across the top of the old doorway the name W.H. Graver, which refers to William Horace Graver, who was the landlord and licensee from 1949 to 1969. Now here we have an obviously older building amidst a lot of new modern development on West Pottergate. And this looks very much like a pub sign. And if we go around the back of it, we will see that it's still a pub. It was a pub, and it was called the Lion and Castle. Now, Norwich had originally 4 Lion and Castles. This one was, when it was first built, known as the Brass Founders Arms, and then became the Saracen's Head about 1840 up until 1969. It then reopened as the Lion and Castle in 1973 through to its closure in 1997. Now here's an interesting sign. It looks very much like a pub sign, but it appears to be proclaiming the White Cottage Apartments. This is on Penn Road off Aylsham Road. But if you look, a little research tells us that it is built on the area that used to be the White Cottage, which had a very fine pub sign, which the developers decided to keep and incorporate in their new buildings. This pub closed in August 2007 and was demolished by the following November. Well, there are some other curious signs that I've come across. This is the new inn. It's now the Roti House, an Indian restaurant on Finkelgate. And research on the Pub Index website showed that when it was being renovated and turned into an Indian restaurant, the corner used to have this beautiful Laken's sign of the new inn and their emblem of the falcon. And I just wonder whether it is still there underneath the information about the menu. I would love to find out. Now, when I was there taking photographs, I went round the corner into Burr Street and found another pub sign, curiously, in a garden. And this is it, the farmhouse. And it's on a garden shed. Now, the farmhouse is still operating on Coleman's Road near to Eaton Park, and it opened in 1940 and became a pub then, a Morgan's pub, as we can see. So how the sign ended up here, I do not know. Now, sometimes you get images found on a building, and the images are linked to the old pub name. Here we see the Cock Inn on Upper King Street. Now, there was an image no longer there of a cockerel, and that's because at one time it was a carriage house. This is the image, the emblem of the Carriage Brewery. The sign has gone too, although the bracket holding it is still on the building. But the Cock was a large pub. It went back a long way and had a back entrance on Crown Road, which we see here. This was opposite the Anglia TV studios. They had 3 studios there and frequented this one, which became known locally as Studio 4. But if we look over the doorway, we will see a very fine plaster cock in the doorway, which reminds us that it still used to be the Cock Inn. Now, this was the first piece of work by John Murray Smith when Murray Smith started working for Morgan's Brewery. He also produced the beautiful panorama, which the Norwich Society found tucked away in a garage in Caister Hall. We bought it and had it restored to its former glory. And you can see here the Morgan's Brewery, which was rebuilt after the Second World War. And this used to be the Cock, and now you can actually find it in the Maid's Head. Well worth going to have a look at. Now, this image can be found on a building in Hayham Street, also linked to a pub. There are several other signs connected with this building. Here we can see the old pub sign has been requisitioned for the present owners. And here a niche telling us which brewery it belonged to. And indeed, it has a plaque as well, very helpfully there, which tells us that it was the Dolphin Inn. If you look at this is the inn in days when it was a pub, and on the right we see it as it is now. But if you look at the doorway, you find it was originally built in 1587 by Robert Brown, who was Sheriff of Norwich, as a small retreat for him. In 1615, it got slightly altered and was bought by Bishop Hall and turned into the Bishop's Palace. By the 18th century, though, it had become a pub and served beer all the way up until the Second World War, when incendiary bombs burnt out the inside. It was repaired and restored by Stewards and Patterson in 1960 and continued on as a pub until the early 2000s. As I was down there photographing the building, I turned round and immediately saw this, which to me said, this must be a pub. It has a corner location, the corner entranceway, and the area where there must have been a pub sign. And research on the Norwich Pub Index website certainly came up with the information. It was the Baker's Arms at 23 Higham Street, closed in 1964. If you go to Hall Road on a Polish shop at the moment, you will find the remains of this coat of arms. And this is connected with the Southwell Arms, as it used to be a pub of that sort. If you look in John Riddington's Young's book of pubs, he took a photograph of this coat of arms when it used to be inside in a much better state of repair. And this was in the Snug. It obviously got moved to the outside of the building when it was rebuilt in the 1960s. Now, it is in Lakenham, and it certainly has been a pub since the early 1900s. Lakenham was owned by James Crowe. And when he died, it got passed to his daughter, who married Sigismund Trafford Southwell. And it was Sigismund Trafford Southwell who started to develop the parish of Lakenham as one of the early suburbs of Norwich, which is why we have Trafford Street and Southwell Street and the Trafford Arms and the Southwell Arms. There is, in a private collector's collection, also the original signboard that used to be outside of the pub. However, the arms are not those of Sigismund Trafford Southwell. They are the arms of Castle Mattress in County Limerick, Ireland, and they had no connection with the Trafford Southwell family, who had a completely different coat of arms. If you make your way to Wenson Street, you're liable to see, if you look up, this fine black horse. Was this a pub? Well, look beside the building and we see that that was the Black Horse Skittle Saloon. And indeed, if you go and look at the gable end in the spring before the leaves actually appear, you will find that you're told it was the Black Horse. The date 1900 was when the roads were widened for trams and many of the pubs got a new makeover. We'll see another one on Elm Hill that was treated similarly. North of the city now, in Miller's Lane, you find a fine windmill. It's not named after the lane, but it is named after the pub. And again, there's a useful plaque a little further along on the building, which tells us that it was the Mill Tavern Public House up until 2005. And the name of the road, the lane, and indeed the pub comes from the old Cat and Tower windmill, which until the 1890s used to stand at the other end of the lane. In opposite the Castle Mall, you can find this fine building. If you look at the roof, you will see two wonderful lions, and that is because it was part of the Lion Inn. And here we can see the entrance to the yard, the very fine entrance to the yard. And up at the top, there are the lions which commemorate the Lion Inn pub. And very strangely, the building next door, which was never a pub, seems to have sprouted a lion as well. Now, sometimes you get brewers' emblems left. This is the building at the end of Elm Hill, which used to be in Elm Hill. It became the corner and now is Olive's coffee shop, when the building in front of it was demolished for the widening of the street for trams. And if we look up at one of the corbels, we will see we have the name of the brewer there who carried out this refurbishment. That's Steward and Patterson's. It was indeed the Turkey Cock, and it had a very fine carved wooden sign, which still survives. And you can go and see this today in the Museum of Norwich at the Bridewell. This building is on the bottom of Grapes Hill, and it was indeed the barn. If you look in the gables, you'll see the anchor of the Anchor Brewery, which belonged to Bullards, still commemorating it as a pub. It used to stand on the other side of the street until in the Second World War it was completely flattened by bombs. It survived after the war in a temporary building, but by the mid-1950s, Bullards built this spectacular building, and the curved frontage was to improve sight for motorists as they approached the crossroads. Also, in addition to the anchor from Bullards, it passed later, once Bullards had been taken over, to the Courage Brewery. And the emblem of the Courage Brewery was this golden cockerel, which is still there. And there we can see the Bullards emblem. That brings me to an interesting emblem found on this building, which is now Cactus Cafe Bar, but it was the Queen's Arms, and it's on the corner of Edward Street and Magdalen Street. It spent a while in the 1950s as Henneke's and was known as Bax. The emblem there, though, if we have a look at it, shows a griffin with its claw on what looks like to be a barrel. Now, this reminds me very much of the Fuller's Brewery emblem. However, there is no evidence that it was ever part of the Fuller's Empire, so I have no idea where that emblem came from and whether it has any connection with the fact that it was a pub at one time. Now, another thing you can look at, which often tells us that somewhere has been a pub, is the stained glass. And a very fine example of this is the Bread and Cheese in Adelaide Street. This can be no doubt a corner entrance and lots of stained glass that tells us that it was selling at one time Bullards ales, wines and spirits, and this was the bar entrance. Now, it wasn't always called the Bread and Cheese, it used to be the Victoria. However, the locals used to call it the Bread and Cheese because there was a very popular landlord who provided bread and cheese every Sunday morning on the bar. And after a while, because everybody referred to it as the Bread and Cheese, it officially changed its name to the Bread and Cheese. If you go to Earlham Road, you will find some fine stained glass bishop's mitres. Here's the view from the inside of the building and the view from the outside. And indeed, they belonged to this building, which was a pub called the Mitre. At the end of Burr Street, you will find a building which has more stained glass in it, including a fine fleur-de-lis. And this was the King's Arms, which was a pub serving the old cattle market at one time. And if you go north of the city to St Martin's Lane and venture down this entranceway, you will find another fine stained glass window that looks as if this building was a pub. And if you look carefully over the doorway, you'll find a silhouette image of a pineapple, and round the corner at the end of the pub, the name Pineapple House. And this is, of course, because it was the pineapple. South of this city now, on Lindley Street, there is an undertaker's, but the building itself looks as though it would have been a pub. We have a corner site, a corner doorway with an impressive pediment over the top, interesting decorations within the building, and over here at this window we can see a similar pediment over the top, which looks as though possibly that was a door at one time. And again, over the top of the door that exists, typical leaded stained glass, typical of Victorian pubs. And indeed, it was the Cricketers Arms. And here we see it in former days as a pub, and indeed that was a side entrance door, which has been converted into just an ordinary window now. Sometimes there are more subtle signs. So if in a row of terraced houses we see a much grander house with, for example, a bold and important frieze over the central window, and especially if approaching that we find evidence of a former cellar opening, then we can be pretty sure this was a pub. Indeed it was the Denmark Arms in Sandringham Road, just off the Earlham Road. Now sometimes houses with strange names like Pineapple are also a clue. So if you go to Hayham Street now, you find flats at Crocodile House. Now the Crocodile was certainly this building. It was a pub flattened in the war and rebuilt in the 1950s. Another subtle sign, you can sometimes see supports for something that once held the old pub sign. This is where Burr Street meets Queen's Road, and it used to be a pub called the Pheasant Cock. Now I couldn't find a photograph of the Pheasant Cock with its sign, but Norwich had two Pheasant Cocks. The other one was in Oak Street. There is a photograph of that, and here we can see a similar sort of sign that would have been over the top there. Another building with these supports is the King's Arms, which is now the Body Shop on the corner of Castle Street and Davy Place. It has quite a few telltale signs, intricate decoration near to the roof, the sign supports, which we will see on both sides of the building, and indeed evidence of a former cellar. And this is the King's Arms that was built shortly after Davy Place was created, and it was built to replace the King's Arms coaching inn at the other end of Davy Place. It used to open onto the marketplace that was demolished so that Mr. Davy could put his new street here. South of the city on Southwell Road, this building still has indications and lamps that look as if it was connected with a sign. Indeed it was. This used to be the Morning Star and had two very fine signs on both sides of the building around the corner entrance. And if you go to the corner entrance and look up at the top, you will still see the names of the old licensees, which is confirmation that it used to be a pub. Now signposts often remain when the pub doesn't. On Old Palace Road, in front of the Old Palace Medical Practice, you see this rather obsolete but rather fine post. It was indeed the post for the pub sign for the Alexandra Tavern, which used to be here on Old Palace Road. Now, on Mile Cross Road, there used to be this building, the King's Arms. It's been demolished. In fact, that is what it looks like now, a rather overgrown area. But outside, the old King's Arms pub sign post is still there and awaiting redevelopment. This pub was built in the 1930s when the King's Arms in Bethel Street was demolished for redevelopment. Now this is an interesting one. On Hall Road, this building was the Cherry Tree Pub, and here we can see its signpost. Well, it's after the sign had disappeared. This signpost was utilised when it became a chemist's. And we see it there. It is still a chemist, but the signpost now has gone. However, a reminder of the name of the pub comes from the name of the road, a little cul-de-sac there, known as Cherry Close. However, and this is really nerdy, some way you can impress your friends, if we look carefully, we can see that there is some concrete in the ground. Now, possibly this just marks where a concrete bollard has been removed. However, we can see that they were put into circular depressions, whereas if you go and look close up, you will find that this is rectangular, and indeed is a remaining clue that was originally the signpost for the Cherry Tree pub. A little further down the road in Trafalgar Street, there used to be a pub about midway down the street on the southern side, known as the Lord Nelson. This was bombed in the war, but they set up in a temporary building on the opposite side of the road. Now, looking at Kelly's street directories from the 1950s, I find this was number 2. If you go to number 2 now on Trafalgar Street, you will see the Trafalgar fireworks, but there's the pub sign of the replacement building for the Lord Nelson, which was lost in the war. And it's time, I think, now to wrap up, but not before I just talk about one or two curiosities. Underneath the new Magistrates Court buildings, there used to be the Beehive. Here it's seen photographed in 1945. And if you look round the corner, you see a very fine ancient mullioned window, which some people think used to belong to Fastolf's house, which was incorporated into the pub building. Now that has gone, but a bit of the Beehive still remains, and the wonderful window was saved and moved to the end of the building on St Martin's Palace Plain, so we can still see a bit of the old Beehive. And indeed the licence was transferred to a newly built pub in Eton, in Leopold Road, which of course is called the Beehive, and you can still go in that today. Also, this is Timber Hill. The building at the end of the street was a pub, and the colour of the building now is a hint as to what it was, because this indeed you're looking at what used to be the Red House. And I'm going to finish with a photograph of a building pub which is still open. This is the Golden Star on Duke Street. However, you'll notice that here the Duke Street is much wider than until you get to the Golden Star, and that's because there used to be another pub here called the Moon and Stars, which was demolished for road widening of Duke Street. And in its place, we get the Premier Inn. But when I was taking a pub tour, and I was telling them about this, someone in the party pointed out, oh, but they've still got the old sign. And there we have serendipitously, the Moon and Stars sign still stands more or less where the pub was. Now, the Golden Star itself was due to be demolished for further road widening. It was intended to continue this widening Duke Street right up to the new Inner Link Road. And reported on the 4th of May in 1974, Norwich City Council sought approval from the Department of the Environment to demolish the Golden Star for the greater good of Norwich over Wensum, in order to allow the widening of Duke Street and to link to the Inner Loop Road. The Planning Committee chairman and the planning officer stressed that they took no pleasure in recommending that this partly 15th century building be demolished, but it had to go. The plan was supported by Mr. L.A. Stevenson, who said that the traffic plan was intended to protect the whole of Norwich and its ancient buildings within. The price was the demolition of the odd building here and there to protect the remainder, a price he was prepared to pay. However, the Norwich Society was not, and they objected to this and successfully managed to prevent further street widening, which is why we are left with the Golden Star. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.